Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here in this talk. Today, I'm going to talk about how we can use specific techniques of machine learning, such as time series, for the energy sector. I am Rosana, and I work at Hakon Time Series, specifically focusing on problems in the energy sector. So I like to think that the problem of the energy sector is very closely related to AI for social impact, because when we deal with a time series in the energy sector, we are basically dealing with the topic number 7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, that is to create more affordable and sustainable energy for all. And we know that we are living in a moment of a climate crisis in the history of mankind, so to say. And this, of course, brings a lot of um, negative consequences to the whole humanity, especially in countries toward close to the south of the world. But overall, every country is affected, and one of the ways that we can tackle the climate crisis is through our consumption of energy. So we can bring more sustainable energy solutions to the world, and we can use, for sure, the power of technology and the power of AI specifically to make this process much faster. So when we talk about the energy transition, we have, I'm afraid that this is not presenting as it should, but I can tell you more or less what is in there. So we have several aspects that we can deal when we are talking about the energy transition. Maybe the most common known is the adherence to renewable energies. But of course, we can also consider that we can make the use of energy more efficient. For example, the use that we have in our daily lives, so we don't waste energy. We can also consider the topic of electrification. So there are currently in the world many countries that are many areas in the world that don't really have any access to energy. And of course, for those regions, most probably the transition will to renewable energies will go directly without having these fossil fuel energy sources related to it, or at least like as a major source of energy. And of course, we are also talking about different sources of fuel that not necessarily come from highly CO2 emitting sources. So, for example, we talk about hydrogen, we talk about many other energy sources. And as I mentioned before, one of the motivations of using AI or using technology in general is to make this transition faster and more efficient, so we can all do our best to reduce our CO2 emissions and limit the climate change aspects that we are seeing, the consequences that we are seeing right now in the world. So when we talk about AI in the energy sector, of course, we have to consider that there are several factors. We like the different sectors or industries in the world are usually divided into business and government, so to say, that is considered the second sector, and there's a third sector that is like more related to organizations or university research and so on. So we need, of course, like the engagement of all those three sectors to actually make an effective change in the world when it comes to the energy transition. And of course, in industry, we talk about a lot research and development and like the creation of new technologies, building new tools that can make this transition faster. But of course, there is a lot to do also with government in terms of policies and implementation of those policies, and also in terms of the third sector by seeing how different communities engage and like how the society itself can also be part of this energy transition. And when you talk about all those changes and all those sectors and so on, of course, like specifically about technology, we can look into the topic of clean energy adoption as being the most, maybe as I mentioned before, like the most common and to do that, like the way that we can use technology is mostly through forecasting of supply or like how much energy is produced, and also demand of energy, so we can kind of prepare the logistics of this energy distribution in a way that makes more sense. But we can also think about installations of facilities, and also like an analytics of how energy is being used, so we can create systems of recommendation that can make it more efficient and so on. And of course, for all those technologies and all those use cases, there are many different AI or data science methods that we can use. Here I'm mentioning just a couple of them. And now what I'm going to show you is a couple of examples of how we can use those um, methods. But of course, I will be focusing a bit more on time series, because this is like the goal of this presentation. So when we talk about time series is basically a data set that contains timestamp data. And timestamped here, like here we are seeing an example of timestamps that is basically an index for your data that comes in terms of a date. But of course, this can also be in terms of time as well. There can be like intervals of, I don't know, 15 minutes, you're checking the data, or can be, here is in terms of days, but you can also have in terms of weeks, in terms of years. Depends a lot on the problem that you are using. But basically, it's a problem that you are looking to that doesn't have a static behavior. So every variable that you are looking into, for example, here we're talking about temperature, we're talking about humidity, we have different, like something that some variables that not only depend on each other, but they also depend on time. So you have, in a way, another dimension to consider, and there is dynamics. So like things change over time. And this can bring a lot of consequences. For example, you can have periodicity. So you can have things that change, but they have somehow some behavior behind. And that's actually what we try to leverage with machine learning techniques or overall time series analysis techniques, to just understand this behavior behind those variables. So when you talk about time series in the energy sector, specifically, like when we talk about energy production from renewable sources, we can consider that renewable sources depend on variables that are depending on the weather. So for example, it can be rainfall for hydro energy, it can be wind and temperature for wind energy, can be solar radiation, cloud coverage, and so on for solar energy. And all those variables depend of time, of course. Like this is something that is not very easy to predict, but they are all variables that change over time. They have seasonalities depending on the season that you are in the year, and depending on where you are in the world. And this is one aspect. But then also in terms of energies, not only renewable sources, but energies in general, for example, the consumption, we can think of the demand of the population that will be affected by different kinds of variables, such as socioeconomics or location and so on. And also, of course, when we talk about facilities, so for example, for whatever energy source that we have, it comes from a facility, be it a power plant, be it a turbine, and so on. And the monitoring of those facilities is also important to understand if things are functioning properly and so on. So, apologies. An example of a use of NLP in terms of like understanding text analysis over time is, for example, the use of for the policy and decision making. And we can think, for example, here of what happened this beginning of this year with the Ukraine crisis and the war that started, and consequently the energy crisis that started here in Europe and worldwide in a way. And here's an example of the simply Google thread, like a search that Google Trends searches that we have for Germany. And then we can see that at the beginning of the year, that started to have a lot of searches about the war, so about the Russian-Ukrainian war. and at the same time, the increase of the searches for solar energy in the country was quite high and stayed steady. And that basically tells us that the population of Germany, especially for this search, um, is becoming more aware and more interested in solar energy, and this is something that we can see in the long run in terms of policy and decision making in industry and government and so on. So this is something like that gives us some direction of how people are thinking, and it is quite an interesting like a topic for the people, especially more like for policy and so on. And this is a good use of natural language processing, because you have to see what kind of like words or kind of like sometimes not only words but like a groups of words or sentences and so on are being searched or combine them. But this aspect of time is quite important, because then you can see that you can look for correlations between events. So another example is the monitoring of dams. So this is something that can be done via satellite imagery, and of course also like the monitoring of facilities. This is what we are showing here on the left hand side of the image. And here we are looking into dams. So for example, for producing hydro energy, and looking to satellite images can give you lots of information from a specific region, like especially like those very like large regions. And here is an example of looking to the displacement of earth or of the soil throughout. Like this is in I think is a centimeter or nanometers, but it's just like to have a notion if there is, for example, a very like a fast displacement that could indicate, for example, that the dam is about to break, and then this, of course, means that we have to evacuate the region and try our best to save people. This is, of course, like in a monitoring of facilities, like in a large scale, but you can also look into in the right hand side here in the image, like for example, the power quality. So for example, you can analyze power quality both in power plants or in households, and you can just monitor and understand how if like the electricity that people are receiving is being received like consistently, or if there is something that looks a bit strange and so on, some anomalies that you can find. And of course, this gives us a notion if there is some problems in the system and so on. Moving on to another example, we have the more like in the economics area, we have the energy prices formation. This is something that for the ones who are in the field of energy is like basically what we call the merit order. So the prices of energy will be dependent on the most expensive source of energy that we have available. And here's an example. If you have a low amount of renewables, here is an example for Brazil, so that's why we are talking about water. But in general, if you have lower amounts of renewable energies, this will imply that the higher that you need more, for example, gas here in this example, and then gas is more expensive. And if you have more renewables, on the other hand, this is like what we see here on the right-hand side, that means that we have more cheaper resources available, and then we will need less to use less of the other resources. And this is what we are trying to transition to, like a scenario where we depend less on gas, where we have more renewable energies, and this hopefully will decrease the prices of energy. But to understand the formation of prices, it's also important to consider that we need to know the sources. And when we talk about specifically about renewable energies, this is something that depends on weather and so on. That's why time series analysis for this specific kind of problem is so important, because we can understand in terms of prices, but for example, we can also look into we need to know how much of energy is produced and how much of energy is consumed, so we can finally come to this model of prices. And when we talk about energy production, here's an example for wind energy. And for wind energy, we can consider, as I mentioned before, that we have climate variables, We also have to consider the facilities because, for example, if you have a wind turbine that can only produce certain amount of energy, doesn't matter if there is more wind, you cannot produce more than that. You can also have to consider that there will be, for estimating this energy, you have to consider there will be correlations to other variables. So other environmental variables, for example, in this case of wind, also temperature. So we can look into wind speeds, but you have to also consider, for example, temperature as well. And of course, the composition of the signals or the time series that you are looking into. So for example, if you want to look into the temperature and wind wind speeds, we have to consider that there might be some trends because of season. There might be some changes because of climate change, for example. There might be like some increase or decrease of those variables as well. And here I'm just mentioning that you can use techniques such as machine learning and data analysis to understand a bit better how you can predict those energy productions. Here is an example of wind, but of course you can apply this for solar, you can apply this for hydro, and also to fossil fuel related variables as well. And in terms of energy consumption, is more or less the same. However, when we talk about energy consumption, it's not something that depends purely on nature. So it's not something like how much the wind blows or something like that. But we also have to consider that there will be kind of human or societal aspects. For example, we can have peak times that we know that people are going to work or that people are at home. Also like climate and weather as well, but more like in the sense that if it's warmer, people, especially in the south of the world, people use more AC. In the north of the world, if it's too cold, people use more heating. So understanding those different infrastructures, so to say, is also important. And of course, like regions in the world that have more economical resources tend to use more energy than regions that are not, that are more like maybe rural and so on. And also variables such as calendar, for example, holidays and so on, will affect the demand of energy because, for example, on holidays, people might be traveling and then they will not be using necessarily the energy at home, but maybe they will be using more energy in like hotel infrastructures and so on. Okay, so moving on. We can also have the energy consumption, understanding energy consumption, for example, through clustering techniques. That is an example of unsupervised learning technique. To understand a little bit of what I was saying before, for example, you can have profiles, you can have just like a bunch of time series from a specific region, and you can look into similarities among those profiles and understand that maybe some, here in the example, one area has like a higher consumption, one group has a higher consumption throughout the day. This might be related more like to the green one, for example, here might be more related to commercial buildings where people are working throughout the day. Then you can have something like the blue curve that is more like when people are, there is a peak in the morning and then a peak at night, but throughout the day is a bit less. And this consumption can be, for example, to, I don't know, fridge or something that is turned on the whole time, but is way less than throughout the morning and evenings. And in the red curve, you have, for example, holidays when people are also traveling. They are not at home, but there are things that are still turned on. And these are examples of ways that we can look into applications of machine learning and specifically time series in the energy sector. But let's maybe have a look a bit deeper into what is behind those techniques that I'm mentioning there in terms of use cases. So for preprocessing and data analysis, and EDA here means exploratory data analysis, we can look into, for example, imputation. So for example, if we have missing values and you're dealing with time series, it's important for those specific cases that you need to understand. For example, if you're measuring, if you're monitoring something in terms of like what resolution, it's yearly, monthly, 15 minutes, and so on. Also, if you have some specific dates, as I mentioned before, for example, if you have holidays or if you have peak times or off-peak times, and this the nature of your problem will define what is the best way to deal with those missing values. So often you will use um, averages, so you can just take the mean value of some time interval. But of course, you can just take the missing value, you can just mimic the same value that you saw before or after in your timestamps around this missing value. You can also use the mean or the maximum of some interval, and you can also consider interpolation. But basically, for example, if you have a missing value for something that has an hour resolution in February or something, it doesn't make sense to use, for example, the average amount of consumption throughout the whole year, because this will not be very consistent with the month of February. So maybe it makes more sense to look into which day of the week we were looking, or if this was a weekday or a weekend or a holiday. So like understanding these nuances from time series is important to determine what is the imputation method that you use. And that's why I mentioned like resolution and specific dates, because then you might use an average or something, or the minimum or max, but then you have to know which interval makes sense for this specific interval that you're looking that is missing data. So you can also look into time series decomposition. As I mentioned before, time series not only have like a pattern, but they can have like a specific patterns of trends, for example, of increasing or decreasing. And they can also have seasonality. The seasonality might be related to specific climate seasons as we talk, but can be some other kind of seasonality. Here is an example on the top right of, for example, the rainfall in Singapore. Because of climate change, we are seeing a trend of increasing the amount of like so to say, like the average is increasing over time, and this is a consequence of the climate crisis. But you can also see that there is a seasonality, that there are peaks and valleys here that is related to, of course, like the seasons that are more rainy than others, and so on. So this is like you see some regularity that comes more or less in the same frequency, and also some trend of increasing or decreasing. Also related to time series decomposition or components that you have, you can also have cycles that is a bit similar to seasonality, but not quite. This is very common in economics, for example. There are like cycles in which you have some behavior that repeats itself, but not necessarily in the same interval of time. So it doesn't have necessarily the same frequency. And this can be related, for example, to different social aspects. For example, here, it's like if you look into stocks, and then you have different crises that happen, or different societal events that happen that will influence, of course, the stocks, and then it will change the behavior. So we have more or less same behavior, but that is affected. And this, of course, will not have the same frequency, because those events that do not depend on something that will be always frequent in the same interval. And of course, like we have also noise. That is basically, we can never reproduce a time series completely. So you can detrend a time series, you can remove seasonality, you can even make some effort to remove cycles, but you still have some noise that comes, of course, from the fact that usually time series are not completely stationary. So you can try to detrend and do all those techniques. So we can, for example, use forecasting techniques, but you have to consider that this is going to be a bit affected by this fact that it's not most of the time series that you have out there are not stationary. Okay, moving on, we can also look into anomalies, and anomalies, especially in the energy sector, come often from weather or weather slash climate in socioeconomics. So for weather, for example, we can think again about the climate crisis. And here it's not been possible to see very well, but like, for example, you can have extreme weather events or special events that are happening because of the climate crisis, and this affect the weather conditions. For example, here's an image of the El Nino that makes the temperature of Singapore also increase to more extremes than we're used to. And this is something that you have to consider when you're building your models, that anomalies might not only be just errors, but actually something that has a physical reason behind. At the same way, we also have socioeconomics that can be, for example, the pandemic or the war, something that will change the behavior of energy consumption. Here's an example of energy consumption um, throughout the pandemic. So we see a lot of residential increase of the residential um, energy consumption and a decrease from commercial buildings. That's something that is still going on. And here I will leave for now the stationarity and autocorrelation is something that I already mentioned. We can also look into feature engineering that is considering different variables such as lag and like variables and moving averages. There are basically to understand that the former steps of a time series will influence much more than like a previous, like something that happened much earlier. So this is like we can create new variables that will be relevant for this analysis, so that we can create new features that will be important for our models. And in terms of time series forecasting, we can look into the interval of predictions. For example, we can have predictions that come in long term and predictions that come in short term. And in terms of forecasting models, you can have different kinds of models that will be important for time series forecasting. For example, you can have models that already receive raw time series, such as recurrent neural networks or Facebook profit or autoregressive models. And also other like traditional machine learning models that will need to have those feature engineering techniques considered over there. And in terms of evaluation, it's important to consider that when we're dealing with time series, it's not only important to look into the metric in terms of like how precise your prediction is, but also like we are trying to predict a behavior. So we not necessarily only want to look into specific like a very precise predictions, but also in the shape of your curve, if that makes sense, if it's increasing or decreasing and so on. And with that, I'll just thank you all and say that the energy transition is here to stay, and we will need to use a lot of technology, and I think time series is a very good use of this. So thank you very much, and stay in touch.
Thank you too, Rosana. Would you like to take this one question down there from Juan? Do you know of any approach of AI or machine learning to predict the El Nino weather event?
I am actually not very sure, because I think that those specific methods that are like for meteorological, there are some uses of AI, but as far as I know, using like physical models are still more precise, because then you are really considering the real physics behind and the methods and so on.